Why do you want to know what's in the dead wax area? I hate that term dead wax, but that's what people use, so I'm going to use it. Of your records. Well, for one thing, it's just interesting. I mean, if you're a real record collector, it's just interesting to know the information you can gather from there to find out who mastered the record, who pressed the record, and how early or how late the pressing is. There's a lot of information you can find out. It's especially important if you're buying used records, because as I'm going to show you, the label doesn't really tell you much of anything. Like, you see on eBay, they'll say, first pressing, and the label will be the original label, but that doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't really let you know whether it is a first pressing, because, as I'll show you, the label can be used in a variety of pressings, manufactured by a variety of places with very different sonics. Never put a dime on the head shell. So, the more you know about this, you can get very deep into the weeds, and you can find out what stamper was used, what mother was used, what lacquer was used. So you know exactly what that record is, when it was made, and how close to the original it is, or an original. But that doesn't mean it's going to sound better. That's, I'll do this much better when I finish this. I really can't. So I'm going to start by using as an example an RCA living stereo from the day that I brought with me. And I'm going to explain to you how close we can get to really knowing where that record came from and how it was made. And I'm not going to do this for every record label out there, because we have the internet. You will be amazed at how much you can find out by just knowing what to look for. You can find out all the information. Unfortunately, the people that were doing all of this cataloging for the major labels, they were sort of librarians. Most of them have passed away, and the systems they used were not well cataloged, and so some of this is actually in dispute. We're going to track at 2 grams. It'll be fine. So, let me take this. This is set up. We're actually ready to do this. I can play records, as long as the dime doesn't move. What? Oh, I thought he put the belt on. It's there. It's there. So, there's no cables. But just luckily, I have cables, because I was going to return some cables to somebody that I borrowed. So we'll be okay. So let's just make sure we have sound before we get going. One of the important things in buying used records is some smaller labels like Vanguard. Anybody here a fan of some of the Vanguard original Stereophile black label records? Those are phenomenal records. And by looking in the inner groove and knowing what those numbers mean, you'll know that the originals were processed by RCA for Vanguard. And RCA did some of the best processing. They did some of the best cutting, some of the best plating and pressing in the plants. So the early Vanguards, if you look on the inner groove, you'll see that it's got all the RCA numbers. But the next generation have Columbia numbers and Columbia setup. And those are not nearly as good, and I'm going to play some of that stuff and show you. And so when I was at a friend's house in Washington, and he was looking for a particular Vanguard, and the individual said it's an original pressing, black label, blah, blah, blah. And I said, ask him whether the numbers start with XSV, and was a stamp as opposed to handwritten. And it was XSV, and I said, don't buy that. It's not going to sound good, because I know that those don't sound as good. So that's the kind of thing we're going to cover in a minute as soon as I get this turntable working. So at any rate, I'm going to take this RCA, and I'm going to show you what you can learn from this. And this is valid for any record that RCA made during the Golden Age, and it's also valid for any record that RCA processed for other labels. And RCA processed records for Vanguard and also for Motown. So all the original Motowns, which sound fantastic, the engineering was great and everything else was great, but they sent all of their tapes to RCA to process. So by looking on the inner groove of original Motowns, Motown, Tom, all those labels, you can also know the following. So on this picture's at an exhibition. If you look on the inner groove area, or dead wax as they say, you'll see a series of numbers. In this case, it says J2 RY 1982-23S. So what does that mean? Well, according to RCA's numbering system, J is the year. And if you go online, you'll find a site that'll give you the numbers. Each year is assigned a different letter. J happens to be 1958. So I know that this record is from 1958. 2 is the label source. So 2 is for RCA records. If it was Vanguard or Motown or any other label that was supplying RCA with the tapes, then there would be a number assigned to that particular manufacturer. Then there's an R. The R is for classical music. So if it had a T or a P, those are for popular music. So if you took out a Chet Atkins album or an Elvis record, you would not see the R, you'd see a T or a P. And then there's a Y. The Y is for stereo. If it was P, it would be for mono. So even if the label was missing, even if it was completely covered up, if you could look at that, just that alone, you'd know what the record essentially was. And also, the 1980, then it says 1982. 1982 is the number of the tape for that year. So it means by the time this was made, RCA already had generated 1,900 master tapes, which sounds like a lot, but that's what it is. Now, my feeling was maybe 1,900 means since RCA started making records, because that's a lot of tapes, but someone says no, it's that year's tape. That's the number of tapes they produced. These are the issues that haven't been able to be really solved because the people that did all of this kind of librarian work are no longer alive, most of them, and so there's some question about that. But that's not that critical. Then 23S, that means it's the 23rd lacquer that was generated from the master tape for this record. And the numbers start -1 and they go up pretty high. And it means that RCA recut this record many, many times rather than generating stampers from parts that would get old, which was a good thing. There are connoisseurs of this who will tell you, if you want this record, lacquer number 7S is the best lacquer, or lacquer 8 is the best lacquer. But in all honesty, that's kind of ridiculous because you don't know, even if you know what the mother was, what the stamper was, everything about it, you don't know what number record this was pressed from that stamper. You don't know what time of day it was pressed, because if you know anything about pressing plants, they fire up in the morning, the boiler gets fired up, and then they start pressing as soon as it's hot enough. But most pressing guys will tell you that there's a particular time in the day, usually around noon, when the whole system is really working well, and the cooling system is cooling the water, and the heating system is heating it, and the whole thing's working correctly. So you really don't know. That's why there's a guy online who hates my guts, named Tom Port, and he wants to hate me, that's fine. But he's a guy who will go through 50 copies of this and play them all and find the one that sounds the best, and he'll charge you $400 for it, or whatever. And there are huge differences among the same press. So you can't really say that this kind of forensics is going to guarantee the best sounding pressing. But it's a good try. At least you're in the ballpark to know. So we're not finished with the numbers here. There's more. There's also going to be another set of numbers and letters, and in this case, you'll see on this record A1. So A is for the mother that was used for this. that means it's the first mother. Does everybody here understand how records are made, how it's processed from lacquer to mother to stamper? Everybody does? Okay, so the A means this is the first mother. If it said B, that would be the second mother. C would be the third. And then there's a number that's 1. 1 means it's the first stamper from that mother. So this record is the 23rd lacquer cut for this record, the first mother and the first stamper. So even though it's the 23rd lacquer, it's the first stamper generated from the first mother produced from the 23rd lacquer. It's early. So that's good. So the chances are this is going to be a good sounding record. Only chance, because we don't know what the press operator was doing that morning, how he was feeling, how the water was flowing. We don't know whether it was the first record or the last record of the day or the middle of the day when things are really beautiful. So right away we've learned a lot about this record. And you can use the same information for any RCA, any early Vanguard, any Motown, or any other record that RCA processed. And also, now that you know the system, you can look through your records, and if you see numbers that are similar to this, you'll know they're from RCA, and then you can use this numbering system to figure out exactly what they were. So there's another number on here too, and that is, it's a letter, and it's an I. And the I means this was pressed at RCA's Terre Haute pressing plant in Indiana. If it had an R, that would mean it was from RCA's Rockaway plant in New Jersey, where I live, in Jersey. If it had a H, that would mean it was pressed in Hollywood at RCA's West Coast facility. And every RCA and every record that they press for everybody else will have one of those 3 letters. Now, there are people who claim that the Rockaway plant is the best one because it's closest to New York, where RCA was headquartered. And there are others that think Hollywood's better and others that think the Indiana plant is better. But how can they know unless they get the same? There's no way of knowing. But they will tell you that anyway. So as you can see, this record has a label that's the original shaded dog label. I know some people think that they think the dog is shaded, but it's really the shading behind the dog that makes a shaded dog. So from that information, we know a lot about this record. We know it was from Indiana. We know what lacquer it was. We know what mother it was, what stamper it was. We know what tape it was in RCA's hierarchy. We know a lot. Even if the label was gone, if the label was blocked off, you'd know a lot about that record. So that's the RCA mystery solved. And you can find that same information for just about every major label if you do a web search. And I'm not going to stand here and do that for every label because that gets kind of boring after a while, okay? So the next thing I want to talk about here with you is why you can't... there's also actually a year code on here. There's a whole bunch of codes. Well, as I said, J was 58, so other years are... K is 59, P is 63, L is... You go through the alphabet starting at 58, which is when stereo records happened, and go through the alphabet and you'll know what year it was. So here are 2 copies of Make Way for Dionne Warwick. And I think this is an incredible record. This has got Walk On By on it, which is some of you older people like me remember this from the radio. And this was engineered by Phil Ramone, who passed away last year, one of the great recording engineers. And if you're used to hearing Walk On By on the AM radio when you were growing up, to hear this record is absolutely mind-boggling because it was recorded live. There was a string section. There were backup singers. There was a trumpet player. There was Dionne singing. I mean, it was a complicated arrangement, all done probably live with everybody in the studio. So here it is. It's Scepter Records, the original label. So this must be an original, you'd think. And if you saw it on eBay from someone who didn't know what they were doing, they would say, that's an original. And here's another original. Well, these are 2 originals, and assuming that the guy that was working the pressing plant that day, was not drunk or something, these should sound pretty close. But when I take this one out of the sleeve, I see it's got numbers on it that tell me it's from Columbia Records. Columbia Records processed this one. And Columbia Records had their own set of codes for their own label and for the ones that they processed outside. And the best way to describe what Columbia did was they had 3 letters to begin with. And then they had a series of numbers, and then a dash, and then a letter and a number. And the dash, number, and letter is the lacquer. So this says dash 1F on it. And the reason I know this is Columbia is because it's got the 3 letters at the beginning with a dash, and then a series of numbers, and then a dash, and then the other thing. But it's a stamp. It's a very distinctive stamp. If you look on any of your older Columbia records, you will see that same kind of lettering and numbering system with a very distinct stamp and very, I don't know what typeface it is because I'm not good at that kind of stuff, but you'll know that it was by Columbia. So I look at this one, and this one has Bell Sound on it, and a different lettering code. It has SLP 523, which is on this one also, but it's handwritten and it says Bell Sound. So you have to know that Bell Sound was a mastering studio in New York, and if you have a lot of records that have Bell Sound on it, and you've played them and noticed what they sound like, they sound incredibly good. Bell Sound was a great mastering facility. And Bell Sound is in kind of like a scripty kind of type. So now here are these 2 records that look exactly alike, and I'm going to make the sacrifice and play them on this turntable with the dime on top and let you hear the 2 records, because if you were to buy this record online from someone who really didn't know what they were doing, they would say, you know, original pressing, because it's got the original label on it. So, all right, I'll play Walk On By. What the heck? So first, this is the, did we get both channels working? What was it?
He just left and said it works out. I don't know why.
Did he? Okay. Let's find out.
If you see me walking down the street and I start to cry each time we meet, walk on by, walk on by. Make believe you don't see the tears, just let me breathe in private. 'Cause each time I see you, I break down and cry.
I'm not going to play the whole thing. My prediction is, before I go any further, that this cable that I happen to have is not really suitable for low-level phono, and its capacitance is blocking the high frequencies because this doesn't sound very good. It should sound better than that. So can we maybe get another interconnect? But I'll play the other one anyway. Let's see. If it makes the point, then it really doesn't matter. That didn't sound too good. It was like, it was horrible. So this is the one that's got the Bell Sound stamp on it.
See me walking down the street
You can hear it.
and I start to cry.
It's a big difference, right? It's huge.
Walk on by.
I don't know what that was. So you heard the difference there? It's huge. And yet they're both same label. And now, Columbia Records did very good work for Columbia Records. But in my experience, Columbia Records did really bad work for other labels for one reason or another. I don't know why that is. Maybe it was sabotage. Maybe it was guys just stamping the clock and not caring. But it's pretty apparent from that. So, but all you could say from that was that is an example where Columbia didn't do a good job. So now I'm going to play you.
The same facilities?
Well, we don't know exactly where, but I assume that they did have their own mastering facility, so they probably cut them all at the same place. So here are 2 copies of Buffalo Springfield again. this to me was one of the great records of that era. Why it hasn't been reissued, only Neil Young knows. Therefore, it's completely irrational as to why it hasn't happened. We don't know. And here's one. That's the original Atco label. So this record's very collectible. And I brought it anyway. I made the sacrifice for you people. Thank you. So that's the original Atco label on that one. You know what's really amazing about this record? You look on the back of this. If you know this record, there are all these thank yous here for all these different people. And I remember when this record came out, did I check this? No. This record came out, I would look on this list. I didn't know who most of these people were. And now I know who most of them are just from, learning about music and musicians and all the people in his life. It's pretty fascinating. You can't do that with a digital download. You know what I'm saying? So here's another copy, and it's the same label. And it looks really clean. And I look in there, and I see the Columbia type stamp in there. Slightly different. This says STC, blah, blah, dash 1A. Well, if this was being sold online by someone who really didn't know much about these record labels, and they knew enough to know that a dash 1A means it's a first stamper, because most record labels, a dash 1 or dash 1A means it's the first lacquer, they would say, this is an original 1A pressing of Buffalo Springfield again. This one has, it's handwritten, same numbers, handwritten. It's got ATLW on it, which for some reason, and I don't know what this means, all Atlantic records, original Atlantic records, have LW on it, and a lot of them have AT on it. And I'm not sure what AT is, whether AT is the initials of the mastering guy. We know that George Piros, who did all the Mercuries, worked for Atlantic and cut a lot of Atlantics, and you'll see a GP on there for George Piros, but not on this one. So this one is handwritten, that one's stamped, and this one actually has the A scratched out, and it says C. So, and this side is also, the A is scratched out, and it says C. So that means it's a third lacquer, not the first lacquer. But what probably happened is the first two lacquers were destroyed. They probably didn't come out well, so they had to use, so the third lacquer, the C lacquer, is probably the original. So I'll play you a little bit of this. So first I'll play you the Columbia version. That's all I'm going to play of that. That song, the introduction to that song, is actually the end of the song, fade out, turned around and spliced onto the beginning of the song. That's, what's it? Yeah, palindrome, right. A musical one. Okay, so that's the 1A pressing that someone on eBay would sell and tell you it's the original. And that's even though I think these cables are actually high capacitance, or they're not really meant for that purpose. But you could still hear the difference was huge. So in my no, this was obviously cut. It was a hotter cut too. And if you look at the grooves, you could see that it's hotter cut. But the highs, which aren't really coming across here, the highs are much more extended, and it's an incredibly beautiful recording, but not that one. So again, someone might say, well, you just finished saying that you never can tell how it's going to sound because you don't know what the press guy was doing, you know. But my experience has been over all the years I've done this that whenever I see a Columbia stamper number for a record from another label, it's going to do that. It's going to be bad. And one thing they did, clearly what they did was they cut it not too hot because they didn't want any coming back. They wanted to get this thing done, you know, get it out the door and make sure it didn't come back. And that's what they did.
Mike, what do you mean by hotter cut?
It's like when you turn the volume up, when you make a tape, you know, if you're making a tape, you can have the meters go a little higher. So, I'm losing my voice. So these were, that was a hotter cut. If you look at the grooves, it's a hotter cut. So when they put the cutting stylus onto the lacquer, they turn the volume up a little higher.
What do you see on the grooves that tells you that?
They're just more modular.
You'll see that the grooves, the wiggles seem to be wider. That's not always telling you everything, but okay. This is a different brand of cable. Just for the heck of it, let's just change the cable. So, yes, it's true that there are variations, even if the numbers are all the same, in what the record's going to sound like. But if you see Columbia stampers, which is 3 letters and a stamp, if you want to look at it later, I'll have it up here. I would avoid any record from another label that Columbia processed. Someone once said to me, "Well, that proves that Columbia used a different EQ curve." You know, there's a whole controversy about EQ curves, and I'm going to read you something about that because that's something I'm very cognizant of. There are actually people that think that Columbia Records used their own equalization curve well into the 70s and 80s. And the reason why that person thinks that is because when they play their Bob Dylan records back and use the Columbia curve, because they have the choice of curves on their phono preamp, it sounds better. So therefore they think that they're online telling people that Columbia used the Columbia curve into the 70s, which is not true. Although that example I just gave you might give you the idea that maybe it is true, but it's not. Now I happen to have a Japanese pressing here too. Is anybody here into Japanese pressings? Okay, so I have to say that I was a Japanese pressing fetishist for a couple of years. I lived in Los Angeles, and I heard my first Japanese pressing. It was the Beatles, the one that's got what was it? What's the record? It's got Let It Be. It's got Let It Be on it. No, it's not Let It Be. What's this? I'm having a brain fade. But anyway, it's the one that's got Old Brown Shoe, and they're standing on the front, and is Let It Be? Yeah. So it's not with the black one with the 4 pictures. It's the one after it. No, it's Hey Jude. It's the one that's got Hey Jude on it. That's the one that's got Hey Jude on it. So I saw that record. It had the Japanese obi, and I bought it. And it just blew my mind how quiet it was and how perfectly pressed it was. And I said, okay, this is the new thing. I've got to replace all my records with Japanese pressing. So I said, no Beatles and no Stones, thank God. But I started, and I was focusing in only on the quiet without realizing at the time, my stereo wasn't so good either, that they didn't have the original tapes. They had copies of copies of copies, or copies of who knows what. And in Japan, they had a very specific sonic taste, which included very little bass, very little. Because I think part of it was that they live in very small quarters with, rice paper walls or whatever, so they have to have no bass, otherwise everybody's hearing everybody else's stereo. And when I finally, as my stereo got better and I realized that I had made this horrendous mistake and gotten rid of all these great original British pressings and replaced them with Japanese pressings that really didn't sound that good, except they were quiet in the back. It's like getting rid of your records for CDs. Well, the background's fantastic. What about the music? Who cares? The background's quiet. So I started rebuying all those records, and luckily it was like 1987 or 8 when I made that realization, and nobody wanted records anyway, so I was able to rebuy everything that I had chucked. But another thing I realized is that by the early to mid 80s, many of the Japanese lacquer creating facilities had gotten rid of the preview heads on their tape machines, and they were using digital delay lines to get the delay so that the lathe would know how to cut the lacquer. And what that means is the cutter head is not getting what's on the tape. It's getting like an 8-bit digital, horrible digital signal, and that's what's doing the cutting. And so now I go back to some of the Japanese records that I never got rid of for one reason or another, and they're horrible. They're horrible. I mean, they're just unlistenably flat, and they sound like really bad CDs, not just bad CDs. So let's play the same track. I haven't played this record. I forgot I even had it. And when I was going through to pull the Buffalo Springfield, I said, oh, there's a Japanese pressing. So let's just play that same track. I know it's going to be quieter than the other two, for sure. Of course, we changed cable, so it's not a really fair test. But oh, we're missing a channel. Whatever it is Lucian did, it's not doing it anymore. So much for that for the time being. This is why CDs are so much easier and digital downloads are so much.
So what is the stamp number on the Japanese?
Well, it's completely something totally different. This is Japanese Pioneer, so it's got a P, and then it's going to have a bunch of other letters that really don't relate to. And these were pressed in limited numbers anyway. Most of these were reissues done for the American market, but pressed in Japan. And some of them sound pretty good, and some of them don't. This one I don't remember, and we're not going to find out by playing one channel on that. Okay, so let's move on to some other examples of. And believe me, I don't have all this stuff memorized because I have a life. The RCA singles, the whole singles market, the 45s, have the same kind of stamper code information. And there are people that are fanatical about 45s, and they can go through and tell you where every 45 that they have was made. And in fact, some of the singles will tell you where they were actually recorded. Like on a single, A1 doesn't mean first stamper, first mother. It means it was done at Webster Hall in New York, which is a very famous venue that many of you know from a lot of the RCA records. And A2 means RCA Chicago, and A3 means RCA Hollywood, and A4 means RCA Nashville. A5 means recorded in the USA, but not at RCA, and A6 means recorded outside of the USA. So, depending on how deeply in the weeds you want to get with this stuff. Okay, so another thing I wanted to talk about was Columbia Records that I've now maligned, but we all know how great Columbia Records sound when they make their own records, when it's for their own artists. And here I've spoken to a lot of people who work for Columbia Records, or Sony, and people who've searched the vaults and do all the work. And the Columbia system is very interesting, and there's some controversy about this. If you buy an original Columbia record, and it's got a -A1 at the end of the numbering system, that means it's a first lacquer. 1A is a first lacquer. It's an original pressing. But a 1B and a 1C are also first pressings. This is according to one set of people that I spoke to. And that's because Columbia, like RCA, had 3 pressing plants, one on the East Coast, one in the Midwest, one in California. And the lacquers would be cut in New York, and they would cut 1A for the New York plant, it was New Jersey actually, 1B for the Midwest plant, and 1C for the California plant. So any one of those is a first pressing, because it was done, the lacquer was cut at the same time, just for the different place. So 1A, B, C is a first lacquer. And then it went to D, E, and F, G, H, and I, and it went as far as It went to L, which was the 11th stamper or lacquer that was used. And then it went to AA. So if you see 1-AA, that means it's the 12th. 1AB is the 13th. 1AC is the 14th. Or, depending on how you look at it, those three would be the same number because it was cut at the same time. But we're not sure of that. And my friend Steve Berkowitz, who did all the Miles Davis reissues and all the Dylan reissues, he's not sure. And he's doing those reissues. He just knows that when he's doing it, he gets a 1A pressing to use as a reference to compare to what they're going to reissue, because he knows the 1A is an original. But again, this is a case where there's a controversy because the librarians who were involved in this in those early days are not around anymore. And so it's not quite sure. Now, if you hear people say that Columbia used their equalization curve into the 80s or into the 70s or even into the 60s, I decided that rather than do it by listening, and using my stereo as a reference for making a ridiculous conclusion, I got a hold of 3 of the original Columbia mastering engineers. They're all really old. None of them remembered about the 1A. They don't remember any of that stuff. But here's what one said about this. To the best of my knowledge, the RIAA curve was adopted from LPs as the industry standard in 1954 and implemented by 55. RIAA is the same curve that was used by RCA prior to standardization. I'm certain everybody was on the same page from 1955 onward. It would absolutely make no sense for Columbia to persist in maintaining its own curve because the number of people who would have the equipment with multiple curves would be dwindling since no new equipment was being manufactured with the capability. So yeah, I seriously doubt there were any new records produced after 1955 with the Columbia curve, and certainly not in the 60s, much less 70s and 80s. Now, for the deniers, they're going to say, well, he hedged his terms. He said, to the best of my knowledge, what is this, courtroom drama? I seriously doubt isn't definitive. So, if you want to go there, fine, but I think that's pretty definitive. The second guy I spoke to said, no, RIAA was the standard for the late 1950s, from the late 1950s. The RIAA curve was actually started out as the AES curve with a slight change made later, which was settled as the RIAA curve. During the 78 era, there were several curves used. Each label sort of had its own curve to try to maximize the fidelity of the old 78s. It's possible that in the EQ used on some of those records from the 70s may have sounded better when switched to any of those curves. Wait, we are talking here about mono playback curves. Unless someone did something really off the wall and experimented with those old curves, I had no knowledge of anyone, including myself, of having done that. RIAA curve was and still is the pre-emphasis, de-emphasis standard from the late 50s. So that's getting a little more specific. The next guy I spoke to was a little bit more sure of this. He said, I can absolutely positively say there was no Columbia curve. I suggest whoever came up with this BS should stop smoking crack and get down to earth, take a walk in Central Park and smell some fresh air. This is the case of another clueless A blank trying to write the book about the music business while working at the Goodyear Tire Center changing oil full-time. Tell that schmuck Columbia was doing the same thing every other studio was doing, using RIAA curve, period. This has to be the most ridiculous crap I ever heard. He's really talking about LP period disc mastering, as we all know, of the Columbia curve used in 78 RPM cutting. So that's pretty definitive to me. And he says a little bit more, but, that's I think that pretty much says it. Now, there's another controversy, and that involves Decca versus London. You familiar with that controversy? Okay. Now, if you look on a UK, Decca and London are the same. It's the same company, but Decca UK could not sell records in America under the Decca record label because another label has that name. We know Decca Records. So they had to have a subsidiary in America called London Records. But the records, it would seem, should be the same records because if you look at the codes, all the different codes, and I'll explain how the Decca code works, they're the same codes. They're the same people doing the cutting. So it would seem that the only thing that could be different would be the label that's put on when they press it. Yet there are people who insist, based on their listening, that Decca records don't sound the same as London records, even though all the numbers are the same. For whatever reason, they're not sure why, but they think there's a difference. I'm not sure why Only one channel worked. Well, wait, so this isn't the right ones, right?
No.
That's not the right ones? Oh, it is? That's phono? Well, I had it in there the last time and it worked fine. Oh, is this dual? Oh, it's dual. Oh, you tell me. Okay, the problem was this is a dual mono thing, so one RCA goes there, one RCA goes there. Yes, that should work. And now I have egg on my face, okay? And I didn't even have eggs for breakfast. Okay, so let's talk about this London thing. So how do you solve this? There are people that insist they're different because they played the two records and the Decca sounds better. Now, we all know that there are differences. Even if all the numbers are the same, there are going to be differences in how they sound. So some of the original mastering engineers are still alive, and they're still working. So I got a hold of George Betty's, who was one of the guys who cut for Decca and London. And here's the questions I asked him, and here's the answers I got. If a UK press Decca and a UK press London have the same matrix information and the same mother and stamper numbers, are they the same record? 1. If the disc has the Decca engraved matrix number and the cutting engineer's letter, and I'll explain to you how you can tell who cut Deccas and Londons, whatever label or catalog number used, they are all the same. 2. This is what he said. All recording companies use the RIAA curve to cut records. This is the industry standard that is used all over the world, and this applies to whatever the speed of the record or the contents of the record. For your information, this is George Betty's talking, not me. The letters FFSS is a logo registered by Decca, and it stands for Full Frequency Stereo Sound. Also, the letters FFRR is also a registered logo, and it stands for Full Frequency Range Recording. So the answer to the question is FFSS is a logo, not a recording curve. Also, RIAA disc playback is the reverse of the RIAA cutting curve. We know that. So that's from the horse's mouth. So these curves on some of these phono preamps that will allow you to have FFSS, FFRR, before they standardized it, there might have been a curve. He's talking about the stereo era. There might have been that curve in the old mono records. But there's no such thing as the FFSS curve, according to the man who did the cutting. Nonetheless, someone who is on the other side of this fence said, I asked general leading questions and the answers don't support your sensationalized conclusions, posted on my website. And then he said, which to me is as bad a thing as you could say to me, was, you treat the facts pretty much like Sean Hannity. And that's, that was a stab in the heart. But I think it's pretty well determined that the RIAA curve is what you want to use on any stereo record made after 1958, even if it sounds better on the other curves. And that's one of the reasons I'm not happy that more and more manufacturers of phono preamps are offering these curves, because what you're really doing is using it as a tone control and a filter. And if that's what you want to do, fine, but you're not playing it back accurately. And then if you go tell your friends that all their records made by Decca have a different curve than the Londons, it just gets into, it's really not a good idea. Okay, let's talk about Decca records. So the Rolling Stones British pressings or London records, their code is a series of letters, LK and SKL. SKL are the stereo ones, LK are the mono ones. And then there's their matrix number, and then there's a dash, and then there's going to be a 1 or a 2A, and it's pretty much the same basic thing. 1A is a first lacquer, 2A is a second lacquer. At the end, well, actually, that's not true. I'm sorry, I lied. 2, it tells you the lacquer. The letter at the end is each mastering engineer at Decca had their own letter. So if your Rolling Stones British pressings or your Decca or London classical records end in an A, then the cutting engineer was a guy named Guy Fletcher. And if it ends in a B, it was Ron Mason. If it ends in an L, it was George Betty's. If it ends in a W, it's Harry Fisher. A lot of people who are connoisseurs of this think that Harry Fisher was the best cutting engineer that Decca had. So now I haven't gone through all my records to see if that's true, but they claim that there's a W, Harry Fisher was the best. K is Tony Hawkins. Tony Hawkins is still alive. Tony Hawkins is cutting records for Speaker's Corner for their Decca Records reissues from the master tapes. So the man who cut them originally in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s is cutting them again for Speaker's Corner from the original tapes. So those sound pretty good. No second generations involved. So, as I'm saying, all of these labels have their own systems. If you look on Decca Records, if you want to know what the pressing was, there's a number code. And you spell out Buckingham, which is where Decca was located, Buckingham, and you assign 1 for B, 2 for U, 3 for C, so on and so on. There'll be 2 letters, and those letters will tell you what stamper number it was. So if it says B, that's stamper number 1. If it says BU, that's stamper number 11, and so on and so on. And that's how you know. You got that? So B is 1, U is 2, C is 3, etc., etc. So if it says C, that means it's stamper number 3. But if it says CU, that means stamper 32. You got it? And I'm math lexicon. It took me a while to figure that out. Now, the same is true of EMI. And EMI, early Beatle albums on Parlophone. Again, if you want to know what the mother was and the stamper was and the lacquer was, the dash at the bottom, -1 is the first lacquer, -2 is the second lacquer, etc. On the left side is going to be a number, so 1 is the first mother. On the right side are going to be letters, and you spell out GRAMOPHLTD, Gramophone Limited. So G is 1, R is 2, etc., and then D is 0, and so if it says GD, that's 10. So I was at a Beatle Fest. I admit I go to Beatle Fest. And there was a guy there walking around with the original Please Please Me on Parlophone, which had a different label. They changed the label right after that record first came out. It's a gold and black label, and it's very rare. There's not that many copies pressed that way. And so I said to him, can I see your record? Because if it really was an original, it would be 1, 1, and G. And sure enough, it was 1, 1, and G. So it was the first stamper from the first, generated from the first mother, from the first lacquer. Yet again, if it was the last record pressed from that stamper, it probably sounded pretty tired. If it was the first one, it probably sounded great, unless the press had just gotten up to speed and it was not. So you can't really know for sure. But the odds are in your favor. If someone advertises an original white album, Beatle white album, and says it's the first pressing, and he doesn't tell you what those codes are, you don't really know what stamper it was. So you want to say to him, well, what are the numbers on the right side? And he looks up, and it's got three letters. It's going to be at least the 100th stamper generated from that mother. So it's going to be late. So if you're paying big bucks for a original pressing of a Beatle album, you want to make sure it's an early stamper. And most people will say if it's under 50, it's considered early. But again, if it's like the 10th record pressed off the 50th stamper, or the 1000th record pressed off the first stamper, the first stamper record's not going to sound as good as the 50th stamper. So that's why a guy like Tom Port sits there and listens and grades them. And I've heard a lot of records that he grades and sells for a lot of money, and they're great records. So I have nothing against Tom Port. Whatever he has against me is, I think what he has against me is I had the nerve to say that some reissues sound better than originals, and he sells originals, and so he doesn't like the reissue business. And he said, I'm prejudiced because I have a conflict of interest because I write for a magazine that sells advertising, whereas he has no conflict of interest because he sells used records and says used records are better. So figure that one out. Okay. Now, there's another interesting series of things you can look at on records, and those are who was the actual lacquer cutter, not from Decca and where you can read those codes. So good mastering houses that are consistently good are Sterling Sound, Master Disc, Bell Sound, Bernie Grundman. So it's Bernie Grundman, it's got a BG on it. And he signed almost all of his records with a BG, even starting when he worked for A&M Records in the 1970s. The one amazing mistake that Bernie Grundman made that I never asked him about, but I have to ask him. If you have a copy of Joni Mitchell's Blue, an original, and the reissue is much better. Sorry, Tom. But if you have an original, it's got Bernie Grundman's BG on it, And I've had that record since it first came out, and it starts, and one channel is missing. And it starts. After like a second, you kind of hear someone plugging something in. And so I assumed that was on the recording somehow, because how would that get out? But the reissue doesn't have that. So, you know, Bernie just cut it and said, what the hell with it? No one will know. Well, these kids won't know, but that's amazing. So also now you have Chris Bellman, CB, who cuts at Bernie's. He's one of the best guys now. In the early days of Sterling, you had LH, Lee Hulko. He was the original owner of Sterling. He did all their cutting at the beginning. And then Bob Ludwig got involved at Sterling, and his always has an RL on it. And the RL, I guarantee you, if you go to User Record Store and looking through records and there's an RL, it's going to be a great sounding record. He is still one of the best mastering engineers, even though he hasn't cut lacquers anymore. So the band's second album, which MoFi just reissued, and they couldn't get the master tape because it's gone. So it's not part of their, the more expensive series. But they got the best next tape they could get, and they did an amazing job with it. And I was very skeptical about this, but I just got a copy of it. And I have a bunch of RLs. Every time I go to a used record store, if I see an RL, I buy it because there's no master tape. So that was cut from the master tape. And the original is amazing. It was one of the great records of the time. And it's got the RL, and it sounds great. So if you see an RL, it's going to sound good. He did a lot of Steely Dan records, and he was very active during the heyday of vinyl. And he also did the original Led Zeppelin II. And he did a cut of Led Zeppelin II that was just off-the-wall great. And Ahmet Ertegun came home with it as soon as it was pressed and gave it to his daughter. And his daughter played it, and it skipped. And it skipped because his daughter had a lousy turntable. So Ahmet Ertegun went back and said, we got to pull this record, and we have to make it again, and don't cut it so hot, and cut the bass down a little bit so my daughter's turntable can play it. And that's what they did. And so there are RL copies out there, not a lot of them, but they're going for like $400 now. And I heard one, and it's worth $400 if you like that record. It's so much better than the later pressings. It's ridiculous.
Robert Ludwig did some classical pressings for Nutsuch, which were also.
That's right. And he also did them for Musical Heritage Society, which they don't want those. Musical Heritage Society would license phenomenal titles from the major labels, including Loretta, which some people have this holy grail for Loretta records. And they got the tapes, and Bob Ludwig cut them, and they packaged them in these horrible white jackets, terrible jackets, but the records are pretty good. And the other label that's really, really good is not the Book of the Month Club. Reader's Digest are good because those are RCAs. But there's another one, and Smithsonian, can't I remember? Their vinyl is red, and they come in these like books. Franklin Mint, thank you for brain fade. The Franklin Mint records are amazingly good. When I reviewed the Wondorf turntable, Alex Bachman, the guy that invented that turntable, brought over a Franklin Mint record of it was a violinist and a symphony orchestra with an original EMI that goes for hundreds of dollars. And he had the Franklin Mint version, and it was spectacular, quiet, and mastered from if it not the analog original tape, then a copy of the tape, but quiet, beautiful, and you can get that at any thrift store for $1, and the original's hundreds of dollars. So you can see Franklin Mint records, and they're in the original packaging. The second generation were terrible. The original packaging is you open it up, and the record is under a plastic disc kind of thing. Those are fun. They did Gate de Parisia and the RCA LSC 1817 that people pay huge amounts of money for. They did that from the tape, and it sounds really, really good. Okay, what else am I wanted to? Oh, so some of the other great mastering engineers, and most of this is just based upon experience. There's a guy whose initials are Bilbo, whose name is Dennis Blackham, and he was very active in the UK in the 60s, and he's still at it actually, but he's not cutting lacquers. And he cut the original Who's Next. He cut a lot of British track records. So if you see Bilbo, it's going to be pretty good. The other great engineer is George Peckham, who has Pecco Duck and another Porky Prime cut. If you see that, he also cut some of the American Led Zeps. I mean, he cut them in the UK and they shipped it lacquers over. George Peckham is incredible. Pecco Duck, Porky Prime cut. If you ever see those he cuts really hot, and those records just rock and roll. They're amazing. Oh, another thing you should never buy is don't buy any EMI UK pressed Motown records. If like people are into imports, they buy. If they see some record they really like and they see an import, sometimes they'll buy. I did that for a while. EMI cut their lacquers for Motown from vinyl. Motown sent them the record, and they took the record and played it and cut lacquers from the record. So, other good of course, the mastering lab. Doug Sachs is another great mastering engineer. Stan Ricker. So if you see a TML, the Who swore by Doug Sachs. So and so did Pink Floyd. So almost all the Pink Floyds and Who albums, if you buy the UK or American, it's going to say TML with a dash, either X or L, and that's Doug Sachs.
The wall, sometimes you see TML,
Yeah.
and then different letters after
That's
an X
right.
or an S. It's not, all four sides don't match.
Right, because he had two lathes going. So one is the master lathe, and the X is the slave lathe. But it's really, he's just doing a lot of cutting at one time. But the only thing is, what also counts is how the plating is done and the pressing is done. So if you get a Cat Stevens T for the Tillerman, an original American from A&M, it's going to have Sterling LH, Lee Hulko on it. If you get the Pink Label Island that goes for hundreds of dollars, it'll still say Sterling LH. But if you play them, they sound totally different. The Pink Label Island sounds like it's got to be a different mastering, even though it's not. It sounds so much better. And the same with something like Peter Townsend and Ronnie Lane's Rough Mix, which is a wonderful record. Doug Sachs cut that, and it was plated and pressed here, and it was plated and pressed in the UK by Polydor, and the Polydor sounds so much better. It's just crazy. So other guys that are really good, guys that aren't so good is Wally Trowgood at Capitol wasn't so good. He's not doing it anymore. He wasn't so good. The Exchange did very, very good cuts in the UK. So if you see the Exchange, those are good. And Mandy at the Exchange, Mike at the Exchange. Who else is on this list? CTS Wembley CTS Studios did some good mastering, and I think they did a bunch of stuff for the Who. I mean, not Who records, but they recorded there. MPO is a pressing plant in Canada, not so great. You can also learn what pressing plant was used for the records on some records. If you buy records currently pressed and you see a U and a circle around it, doesn't mean it's kosher. It means it was processed at United in Nashville, the worst pressing plant in the country, unfortunately. And they do terrible plating. I mean, they ruin lacquers. And like David Byrne put out a record last year with St. Vincent. It was a heavily brass record. So side one has Sterling sound stamp on it. Side two has Wes Garland at Nashville Record Productions. I know Wes Garland. He's an audiophile. And I called him and I said, well, how come you did side two? He said, well, United destroyed the lacquer on side two, and the record company didn't want to go back and recut, so they just sent over the CD, and I cut a lacquer from the CD for side two. United they don't know how to press. They certainly don't know how to press 180s. They have non-fill. Every record from that plant at the beginning. So, but what can you do if it's a record you want? There's this new artist Laura Marling. Anybody ever heard of her? She's like a Joni Mitchell. I hate to use that kind of thing. She's wonderful, and they put a 2-record set out, and the lacquer was cut, I think, at the Exchange in the UK, and so they sent the lacquers over to United, and United processed it, and it's just noisy. It's just a noisy, and it's folk music, so it kind of ruins it.
Pink Moon, the European one is so much better than the U.S.
Well, yeah, now they only do. It's all done at Optimal. I mean, they don't press them here anymore. There's confusion because UME pressed it for 6-8 different versions over the last 2 or 3 years. But now, if you get one that's pressed at Optimal in Germany, which is a great pressing plant, that's
For Blue Notes, mono Blue Notes, and it has an ear in the bit wax. It tells you that's an indication of like the plant that was pressed at or something.
yeah. I don't have all of the information, but if you go online, you'll find lists of squiggles for what pressing plant it was. The early records were pressed at. Also, RVG, which is Rudy Van Gelder. That's a very famous one. There's, the lists here go on and on. I've got pages and pages of these things, and if you go online, you'll be able to find these. And then if you go through your records, once you're cognizant of this, if you start going through your records and playing them, as you play them, noting who cut it, you'll see the ones that sound really great usually come from the same bunch of guys, the same few guys. You know, Tim DeParabicini rebuilt, I think it's the Exchange, but I don't remember offhand. One of these facilities, he did all of the, he cut there also for some time, and so that sounds good. So if you go through your records, then when you go buy used records and pull it out, see who did the cutting, you'll know whether it's going to be good or bad. You see who did the plating, who did all of this different work, and you'll have a much better idea whether you're getting a record that's going to sound good or a record that's going to poop out on you. So, I see my time is up. Can I answer any questions for you?
Michael, will this be available online, these reference materials at Analog World?
Well, you know what? I've been asked to do that, so I'm going to have to go through and type all this in on my site and put a P after each one so it turns into a list. It's so much fun. I will put all this up in the next week or so. And I'll bake you all a cake, too. No, I really will do it, I promise. Any other questions I can answer? Yes?
Yeah, do you have any idea who mastered the Franklin Mint?
No, I called up the Franklin Mint and tried to find that information out. They don't know. But they really cared. And the vinyl formulation they used, this red vinyl, is really, really good. But the second pressings they did, don't buy them. They're the ones that don't come in with that plastic thing over the record. I bought a bunch of those on eBay, and they were uniformly badly pressed. So, but all the first pressing ones I bought sounded wonderful. Is that it? Great. Thank you very much for coming, and have a great show. When you go buy records in the room there, pull them out and see who did it.